Listen carefully. This is not background noise. This is not something you play while doing something else. This moment matters. If you are hearing this right now, it is because your life has reached a point where it could not continue the same way. Something had to interrupt the pattern. Something had to break the loop. Something had to stop you long enough for truth to reach you. You didn't arrive here by accident. You were stopped on purpose. And the fact that you didn't scroll past this tells me something important about you. You are not asleep. You are not unaware. You are at a turning point. 1. This interruption is not random expanded. The disruption you've been feeling didn't appear out of nowhere. The delay that slowed your progress wasn't a mistake in timing. The sudden loss, the silence that replaced noise, the redirection you never asked for, none of it was chaos. It only felt chaotic because it interrupted a direction you had grown attached to. When life moves the way we expect, we call it normal. When it stops cooperating, we call it wrong. But that's not how alignment works. Alignment doesn't ask for permission. It intervenes when drift becomes dangerous, and you were drifting. Not in obvious ways, not in reckless ways, but in subtle ones. The most dangerous kind. You were moving, functioning, surviving. On the surface, things were fine, but underneath, something essential was being neglected. Your attention was divided. Your priorities were slowly shifting. Your inner compass was being overridden by momentum. So God stepped in, not violently, not dramatically, but precisely. You've been labeling this season as bad timing. You've told yourself you're just tired. You've blamed burnout, people, pressure, or circumstances. Those labels are convenient because they don't require reflection. But the truth is sharper than that. God is interrupting your life because the version of you that was forming was no longer aligned with the purpose placed inside you. This interruption is not punishment. It is prevention. There is a difference between destruction and correction. Destruction removes without warning. Correction interrupts before the damage becomes permanent. Correction slows you down while there is still time to adjust. That's why this interruption came before everything collapsed. If God wanted to break you, He would have let you keep going. He would have allowed the wrong direction to exhaust you completely. He would have waited until resentment, regret, or emptiness took root. But He didn't. He stopped you early. And that's the part you need to understand. You were not interrupted because you were failing. You were interrupted because you were succeeding in a direction that would have cost you later. You were building momentum without alignment, making progress without clarity, growing outward while drifting inward. That kind of success is dangerous. So God applied resistance, not to block you, but to wake you up. Correction doesn't feel gentle when you're inside it. It feels inconvenient. It feels frustrating. It feels unfair because it interrupts plans you already justified. But correction is not meant to feel good. It's meant to feel necessary. And deep down, you know it was. You felt the unease before the interruption came. You sensed the misalignment in quiet moments. There were thoughts you avoided because they challenged choices you weren't ready to reconsider. There were moments where something inside you said, "This isn't it," but you kept going because stopping felt scarier than drifting. So God stopped you, not because you were weak, not because you were disobedient, not because you failed, but because you were capable of more than the path you were settling for. This interruption is proof of capacity, proof of calling, proof that what you carry requires a higher level of alignment than what you were allowing. Average paths don't require interruption. Small lives don't trigger correction. People meant to stay asleep aren't awakened like this. You were interrupted because your life is meant to move with intention, not autopilot. And now the question is not why this happened. The question is whether you will listen, because this moment right here is the difference between correction becoming clarity or becoming regret. And it starts with recognizing this truth. This interruption is not random, it is precise. 2. Why God interrupts chosen ones expanded. God does not interrupt everyone. That sets the part most people miss. Many people drift their entire lives without resistance. They move in the wrong direction, compromise slowly, settle quietly, and nothing ever stops them. No disruption, no awakening, no internal alarm. That alone should tell you something about why you were interrupted. Interruption is not random, it is selective. Comfort is dangerous when it's misaligned. Stability is dangerous when it keeps you asleep. And progress is dangerous when it pulls you further away from who you were meant to become. You weren't set interrupted at your lowest point. You weren't stopped when everything was falling apart. You were interrupted when things were just good enough to keep you there. That SEP's intentional. God intervenes before stagnation becomes identity. If he had waited longer, comfort would have numbed discernment. Routine would have replaced conviction. You would have adapted to a life that looked acceptable on the outside, but felt empty on the inside, and called it maturity. So God didn't set wait. He disrupted momentum before momentum carried you too far. This is how divine correction works, not by destroying what you built, but by exposing what it cannot support. You were beginning to rely on systems instead of truth, schedules instead of purpose, validation instead of alignment. And none of those things are strong enough to carry what you're meant to hold. So resistance appeared, not to punish you, but to protect what sips in you. Chosen ones are interrupted because their lives carry weight, because what they influence matters, because what they build affects more than just themselves. And anything with weight requires alignment, or it collapses later. God does not interrupt people. He plans to discard. He interrupts people he plans to trust. If your life were insignificant, there would be no need to correct your direction. If your future were small, there would be no urgency to stop you early. But the fact that things were halted tells you something undeniable. Where you are going cannot be reached on autopilot. You were moving too fast to hear, too busy to notice, too focused on making it work to ask whether it should work. So God introduced friction, and friction always feels like opposition when you don't understand its purpose. But friction is what slows you down enough to regain control. Think about it. Brakes don't mean a car is broken. They mean it was moving fast enough that stopping safely mattered. And God does not apply brakes unless speed plus direction equals danger. That SEP's what happened here. You weren't being blocked, you were being recalibrated. The interruption exposed what you were avoiding. It forced stillness where there was distraction, silence where there was noise, reflection where there was reaction, and that's uncomfortable. Because silence removes excuses. In silence, you can set blame the pace, you can sit blame people, you can set blame circumstances, you pale left with truth. That's why this season feels heavy, not because something is wrong, but because something is being revealed. God interrupts chosen ones because they are capable of carrying clarity, not just comfort, because they can survive the pause without losing their identity, because they can be corrected without becoming bitter. This interruption is proof that you are trusted with truth, and the pause you're in right now is not a setback. It's the space where alignment is restored before acceleration resumes, but only if you stop fighting it. Because the interruption isn't asking you to quit your life, it's asking you to realign it. And that sips the difference between people who awaken and people who repeat the same cycles with different faces. This interruption is not meant to break you. It's meant to position you, and what comes next depends entirely on whether you recognize that in time. 3. The pattern of divine interruption expanded. If this interruption feels unfamiliar, it's because most people don't recognize it while they're inside it. They only understand it later, looking back, when the outcome finally makes sense. But interruption has always been part of how God works. It is not a modern concept. It is not a coincidence. It is a pattern. Throughout Scripture and history, God interrupts people before he elevates them, never after. He steps in when direction matters more than comfort, when clarity matters more than speed. Moses wasn't interrupted when he was lost. He was interrupted when he had settled. He had built a quiet life in Midian, managing responsibility, staying out of trouble, surviving. And that's exactly when the burning bush appeared. Not when Moses was desperate, when he was comfortable enough to stay hidden. That interruption wasn't sit dramatic for spectacle. It was deliberate. God was saying, "This version of your life is too small for what you were meant to carry." Jonah wasn't interrupted because he didn't hear God. He was interrupted because he heard and chose avoidance instead. The storm didn't come to punish him. It came to stop him from running long enough to confront his calling. The storm wasn't staked against Jonah. It was for his future. Joseph wasn't interrupted because he lacked integrity. He was interrupted because he had it. Betrayal forced him into obscurity, not to erase him, but to prepare him. The pit, the prison, the delay, they were all interruptions that removed Joseph from timelines that couldn't support his destiny. Promotion didn't come in spite of interruption. It came because of it. Paul wasn't interrupted when he was confused. He was interrupted when he was convinced, certain, confident, wrong, but sincere. And God stopped him on the road not to humiliate him, but to reframe his vision. Blindness came before clarity. Stillness came before direction. This is how transformation happens. Interruption dismantles certainty so truth can enter. And if you're honest, that's exactly what this season has been doing to you. You were certain before, certain about the plan, certain about the direction, certain about what needed to happen next. And then certainty collapsed. Not because you were foolish, but because certainty had replaced discernment. God does not interrupt people to shame them. He interrupts them to wake them up. Because the greatest danger isn't that ignorance. It's his confident misalignment. That's why interruption feels disorienting. It removes the illusion of control. It forces humility. It breaks routines that protected false certainty. And here's up to the part you need to hear clearly. If God wanted to discard you, he would have let you keep going. Silence can be judgment. Interruption is involvement. People who are meant to fade are ignored. People who are meant to rise are corrected. This interruption is proof that your life is still under active guidance. God doesn't waste time redirecting people. He plans to abandon. He intervenes because something in you is worth preserving, shaping, and eventually releasing. And just like every story before you, this interruption is not the end of your movement. It is the pause before alignment, the reset before acceleration. The clearing before purpose becomes visible, but only if you recognize the pattern while you're in it, because the people who resist interruption repeat cycles. The people who understand it step into transformation, and now you know which one you are being invited to become. 4. Nothing was wasted, expanded. You need to hear this clearly, because this is where most people lose hope. Nothing was wasted. Not the time. Not the effort, not the waiting, not the silence, not the pain you couldn't explain. Nothing was wasted. It only feels wasted because you measured it by visible results instead of internal preparation. You looked for progress and found delay. You looked for reward and found resistance. You looked for confirmation and found silence. So you assumed something went wrong. But preparation rarely looks productive while it's happening. God does not prepare people in public. He prepares them in hidden places. That's why this season felt lonely. Why encouragement faded. why recognition disappeared, why you had to keep going without applause, without reassurance, without feedback. You weren't being ignored, you were being trained. Training happens in repetition, not excitement, in consistency, not recognition, in endurance, not visibility. And endurance is only developed when no one is watching. Think about it. Seeds don't grow where they're admired. They grow where they're buried. Underground feels like abandonment, but it's actually protection. Nothing that grows above ground survives without roots strong enough to support it. And roots are formed where light is absent. That's why the silence was necessary. The silence exposed what you relied on for validation. The waiting revealed how you handled uncertainty. The delay strengthened muscles you didn't know you'd need. Every unanswered prayer refined how you listen. Every closed door refined how you discern. Every moment you kept showing up without reward refined your integrity. Nothing was wasted. The interruption stripped away shortcuts. It removed dependencies that couldn't travel with you. It forced you to confront motives you never had time to examine before. And yes, it hurt. Because growth always hurts when it confronts attachment. You were attached to timelines, to expectations, to outcomes that made sense to you. But God wasn't stuck preparing you for what made sense. He was preparing you for what was necessary. And necessity doesn't consult comfort. What feels like lost time is often time spent becoming unshakable. What feels like stagnation is often stabilization. What feels like delay is often alignment being locked into place. If God had given you what you asked for earlier, it would have crushed you. If He had opened those doors before the interruption, you would have carried insecurity, impatience, or misplaced identity into places that require clarity and restraint. So He waited, not because you weren't ready to receive, but because you weren't ready to sustain. Nothing was wasted. Every moment built endurance. Every setback built discernment. Every quiet season built depth. And depth matters more than speed. Because when momentum returns, and it will, it won't be fragile. It won't depend on praise or panic. It won't collapse under pressure. It will move because you are rooted. This is not lost time. This is invested time. And the proof will be seen not in how fast you move next, but in how steady you remain when movement resumes. Nothing was wasted. Say it until your mind accepts what your emotions resist. Nothing was wasted. 5. The cost of ignoring this moment. Expanded. Here is the part that determines everything. Interruption alone does not change a life. Awareness alone does not create transformation. Understanding alone does not move destiny. Response does. And this is where many people fail, not because they don't hear the message, but because they delay obedience. You can recognize this interruption and still ignore it. You can feel convicted and still return to autopilot. You can agree emotionally and still refuse to adjust direction. Nothing forces alignment. It must be chosen, and choosing alignment always costs something. If you ignore this moment, nothing dramatic will happen immediately. That's what makes it dangerous. Life will continue. You'll stay busy. You'll find distractions. You'll convince yourself that you'll deal with it later, when things calm down, when clarity improves, when fear fades. But later has a price. Ignoring correction doesn't erase it. It postpones it until the cost is higher. What is being offered now as guidance will return later as consequence. The pause you're resisting will turn into burnout. The warning you're dismissing will turn into regret. The quiet discomfort you're numbing will turn into dissatisfaction you can't escape. This is how people wake up years later, asking how they ended up somewhere they never chose, not through one big mistake, but through many small moments of hesitation. Partial attention feels harmless, but partial attention creates partial alignment. and a partial alignment creates unstable lives. You cannot skim transformation. You cannot multitask realignment. You cannot carry old habits into a new direction and expect peace. This moment is asking for honesty you may have avoided. Where are you forcing something that requires surrender instead? Where are you holding on because letting go would bruise your pride? Where have you been calling patience what is actually fear of change? Ignoring these questions doesn't make them disappear. It just ensures they return louder. This interruption is a checkpoint, and checkpoints exist for a reason: to prevent people from going too far in the wrong direction. God is giving you the chance to adjust before the road narrows, before responsibilities increase, before pressure multiplies, before your choices affect others more than they do now. That opportunity once set. Always be this gentle. Right now you are being slowed, not shattered. Paused, not broken. Confronted, not condemned. But ignoring this moment guarantees a harsher correction later. Not because God is cruel, but because alignment matters too much to leave optional forever. You are standing at a decision point. Either you respond now with humility, honesty, and courage, or you move forward unchanged and meet this lesson again under heavier consequences. This is not fear, this is clarity. Because real love warns early, and what happens next depends entirely on what you do with what you've just recognized. 6. Alignment is now expanded. There is no better time than this. Not because everything is clear, not because fear is gone, not because conditions are perfect, but because delay is no longer neutral. Alignment does not wait for comfort. It responds to clarity, and clarity is what this interruption has already given you, even if it came through discomfort. You don't need more signs. You don't need more confirmation. You don't need to fully understand what comes next. You need to respond to what you already know. Alignment is not about dramatic changes all at once. It is about decisive adjustment, about turning your attention back to what matters before momentum resumes. This is the moment where you stop negotiating with misalignment. Stop telling yourself you will align later. Stop delaying the conversations you know you need to have. Stop staying in situations that quietly drain you because leaving feels inconvenient. Alignment begins with honesty. Honesty about what no longer fits. Honesty about what you've outgrown. Honesty about what you've been tolerating instead of choosing. This is not a season to rush forward blindly. It is a season to slow down intentionally. Listening now saves you years later. When alignment locks in, movement becomes lighter. Effort becomes effective. Decisions stop draining you because they stop fighting your values. That's what you've been missing. Not strength, not discipline, not motivation, but alignment. God is not asking you to abandon your life. He's asking you to reorder it, to place purpose above pressure, truth above urgency, integrity above appearance. And when that order is restored, acceleration follows naturally. This is how momentum returns without chaos. This is how doors open without force. This is how progress resumes without inner resistance. But only if you choose alignment now, because alignment delayed is alignment denied. Not forever, but long enough to cost you peace. So pause here, not to overthink, but to commit. Commit to listening instead of rushing. Commit to adjusting instead of just enduring. Commit to clarity instead of comfort. This moment does not ask for perfection. It asks for decision. Alignment is now, and once it is chosen, everything that follows will finally make sense. 7. Activation and awakening expanded. This is where it becomes real. Not because you felt something, but because you decide something. Moments like this don't come often. Most people live years on autopilot, waiting for clarity while avoiding stillness. You were given stillness. You were given interruption. You were given truth. Now you are being asked to respond. Not dramatically, not emotionally, but intentionally. Awakening is not a feeling. It is a choice to live differently once you know better. You don't need to announce anything to the world. You don't need to rush into action. You don't need to explain yourself to people who won't understand. You need to move forward with awareness, to stop pretending you didn't notice what was revealed, to stop returning to habits that no longer fit, to stop shrinking clarity, to maintain familiarity. You were interrupted because your life is meant to move with direction, not drift. And from this point forward, you are responsible for what you know. That sips not pressure. That sips empowerment. Because awareness gives you authority over your next steps. What once confused you can no longer control you. What once distracted you no longer owns you. What once drained you no longer deserves access. You are not behind. You are not broken. You are not late. You are aligned if you choose to stay that way. And staying aligned requires participation. So here is your activation. If this message spoke to you, acknowledge it, not for validation, but for commitment. Like this video as a signal that you are present and paying attention. Leave a comment, something simple, honest, grounded. Like I choose alignment, or I spam listening. Subscribe if you are ready to continue walking with awareness instead of slipping back into autopilot. These actions are not about engagement. They are about agreement. Agreement with clarity. Agreement with responsibility. Agreement with the version of you that no longer ignores truth when it shows up. This interruption was not meant to scare you. It was meant to position you. Nothing was wasted. You were prepared. Alignment is now. And from here forward, you don't move blindly. You move awake. You were not stopped to be delayed. You were stopped to be directed. What felt like interruption was protection. What felt like resistance was guidance. What felt like silence was precision. Now you know why things couldn't continue the same way. Now you know why you couldn't stay where you were. Now you know this moment mattered. Don't rush past it. Non-spet minimize it. Don't return to autopilot. Carry this awareness with you, because from this point forward, every step you take is a choice. And you are no longer walking blindly. You are walking aligned.